It's my pleasure to introduce Fred McGinn to the group this evening. He's been the chair of the Hospice Society in Greater Halifax since 2008 and a member of the board there since 2005. After the death of his parents, he started to work for a volunteer organization dedicated to improving services for individuals with life-threatening illnesses and their families. So I think it's very appropriate to have Fred here as a guest speaker for us. Fred is also the director of the School of Health and Human Performance at Dalhousie University. He lives in Halifax with his wife Jennifer, who happens to be the coordinator of the Hospice Bereavement Program. And they have 2 daughters. So welcome, Fred. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you.
And I'll just turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and it was actually through my wife, who is the bereavement coordinator, that the connection was made. It's taken a little while, I think. Going back to November, I think, when I was contacted. And scheduling didn't work out very well, but this beautiful spring night in Nova Scotia. Happy to be here, and happy to talk about the Hospice Society. And probably the best place for me to begin is with my parents, and as mentioned in the introduction. So the reason I start with them is because they took very different tracks when it came to end-of-life care. Quite opposite, in fact. So my mother passed away in the house that my wife and I currently reside in. We were able to care for her, and with some minimal assistance from palliative care services here in Nova Scotia, VON, etc. And we were able to bring about what you'd sort of classify as a wonderful end-of-life experience. And so I come from a fairly large family. All my siblings were home, and all the nieces and nephews, and my wife and our children were there around her. And it was everything that you would want, I think, in that type of experience. It was actually a very beautiful thing. As more and more time goes by, and my experiences with hospice and palliative care go, I recognize that I was very fortunate to have that and to share that with my mother. You can see where I'm leading here, because my father took a very different track. And when my father became ill, we were unable to care for him in the home. But his illness was very prolonged and uncertain. And for the most part, he was just sort of dormant in a hospital bed. And so he spent the last 4 months of his life sort of jumping around from acute care bed to acute care bed to acute care bed, which unfortunately is the path that most people in this room will take. Here in Halifax at the QE2, and on the very last day of his life, he was moved to the VG, to palliative care. But before that, he was in a mixture of rooms with the living. You know, he was taking up a space that was made for the living, not for the dying. That was essentially the point here. People that needed hip operations, people that were being treated, and then behind the curtain was my father. And this is not an unusual story. It's very common, unfortunately. So it had nothing to do with the people that were caring for him, and that was wonderful. What it had to do, and if he had known then how much space he was actually taking up in this hospital setting, I think knowing him as I do, he would have been very upset. And the cost of his care and the lack of a home-like setting really contributed, I think, to his own care and the family's sort of approach to his death, which is very different. So the night he died, I was there with him, and it was quite the opposite of what my mother experienced. And so that's when my parents passed away. I was looking for something in the community, and because when you're caring for your loved ones, you don't have time really to do that. And so I came across the Hospice Society of Halifax back in 2005. And I've been with them ever since, with the goal of actually creating the ingredient that my mother had that my father didn't have, so that everyone could have that. And that's what I want to talk to you about this evening, is about the concept of hospice. It's not a new concept. It's not something that we made up. It exists all across Canada, North America. Unfortunately, it does not exist in Nova Scotia. And so our goal is to make it happen. And I'm going to sort of walk you through what we've been doing regarding that. And certainly take any questions. So this is where it begins, is the majority of us will die in an acute care bed. Later on, I'll show you some data that we gleaned from Capital Health. And it's the same basic statistics. It's somewhere in the 75 to 78% of all deaths occur in acute care beds. And again, just for clarification, an acute care bed is a bed for the living. It's the bed that, you know, your aunt who needs the hip operation is waiting to get into. And it's a very inaccessible way of moving through the healthcare system, if you will. In other words, the economics of it alone make no sense, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But emotionally, as I alluded to earlier, it's also the wrong place for that person to be. So the issue of terminal illness is, I think, where we begin here. The definition of where there's nothing more that can be done to cure someone is actually where hospice and palliative care begin. Because, you know, death is a part of life, and that's really the philosophy of palliative care. So palliative care itself, the Latin root is palliare, which means to mask or cover up, and to mask or cover up pain and symptoms is where palliative care, the term, actually comes from. And this philosophy of care is where hospice and palliative care kind of cross over. They're interchangeable words, and that one is often used for the other, but there actually is a difference. So hospice is actually the physical location. Palliative care is the philosophy of care that goes with that location. Hospice, again, I don't want to be highfalutin with my Latin here, but I've been repeating this for a long time. It's a hospitium. It comes from the Latin root, and it's a stopping place for weary travelers, essentially, is what that means. And I think it's quite fitting the way we use it in terms of palliative care. A little history here. So Dame Cecily Saunders started the first modern hospice in England in 1967, a place called St. Christopher's Place. And very shortly after that, she brought the concept to North America, to actually Massachusetts initially. And it spread across both the United States and Canada. So today in Canada, there are about 41 hospices, and different shapes, different sizes, but they're all homes. They're all freestanding. And that's the point I also want to stress today, is that we're talking about an actual home-like setting for persons who cannot stay in their own home. And so it's my father, essentially. It's getting the person out of an acute care setting into a place that looks and feels like a home. And that's what hospices are. There are no, you know, hours. There are beds everywhere so family can stay. There are living rooms. There are playgrounds for children. I mean, it's essentially everything you would expect in a home. And it's this end-of-life care philosophy that is incorporated inside that home. So hospice, from our perspective, is a unit. It's a building. It's a place you go. And it's the type of programs and services that you would receive at such a building. So it's not just about the individual in a hospital bed. It's about bereavement, it's about respite, it's about education, it's about library resources and everything else that goes into that. And I'll speak to a little bit about that as I go through this. And again, if you ask people, and there's a significant amount of research on this, death and dying is not a topic most people want to approach, obviously for many reasons. But when push comes to shove, people generally say, when asked to describe the death experience of themselves or a loved one, they describe what my mother had. That's what they describe. And the sad reality is that's not based on current situation, what's going to occur. And so I'm going to talk about the hospital, the medical structure that we currently live in, and how hospice fits into that. And remembering that this is not something that our group is bringing across for the first time. This is a relatively old, proven concept. It's not a hard concept to sell, but it's a very hard project to deliver. And I think that's the issue. We've never had, in my 8 years with the hospice, anyone who has looked at me after a presentation like this and said, well, that's a silly concept. Why would you want to do that? It's quite the opposite. So you're going to hear a little bit of frustration in me, because I've been at this for a while, and our organization has come very close this year to actually establishing our goal, but we're not there yet. So again, just the sort of philosophical statement of the type of services that you'd get at a hospice. I think the second piece is the most important, recognizing the dying process is a part of the normal process of living and focuses on enhancing the quality of remaining life. It affirms life and neither hastens nor postpones death. That really is ingrained, I think, in the first hospice that Cicely Saunders developed and is maintained today. And you would get this type of response from anybody or any hospice that you visited in this country. The closest hospice to where we sit today in Halifax is in St. John, New Brunswick. It's called Bobby's Place. Just opened up officially last year, but it took them 20 years to get there. They renovated an old convent, and they've been huge supporters of the Halifax Hospice Society, and I'll mention them a little bit more about them as well as we go through here. But so essentially the hospice philosophy, if you will, is about caring for the individual at end of life, but the individual's family, their friends, and everyone that's associated with that person. Here are some of the characteristics that you would get. The last 3 months of life, 60 to 70% are cancer patients. It's a younger population than residential care. For the most part, 50% under the age of 70. Importantly, less likely to have caregiver support. Even if you have caregiver support, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can keep your loved one at home. But it certainly increases the likelihood that you can with some assistance. But when you don't have that, and I use my father as an example, it's not that we didn't have enough bodies around, we just couldn't provide the care for his particular situation. Most of the patients are admitted from the hospital, so on our board we have 3 physicians. We have a palliative care physician, and essentially that is the process you would get. You'd go from palliative care. The services would extend right to the hospice, and that's how the communication would take place. And the average length of stay in a hospice is about 3 weeks. And without trying to get too much into the economics of a very emotional argument that we're putting forward, there is an economical argument here. And when we talk about open hospital beds or closed hospital beds in this province or any province, and the struggles that health ministers have when this comes up, hospice turnover is relatively quick, and by that it means that the beds are used. So if you actually only had 5 beds, it might not seem like a lot, but at the end of a year, 5 beds becomes 150 beds, etc. So I don't know what my math is on that, but it's a different equation that's used. This is a picture of Vernon House Hospice, and typically this is what you'd see across Canada, as a home that would look like that, accessible. These are the services, the emotional and spiritual care, the optional services such as music and massage, support for healing. This is, again, what we would want and what we don't quite have yet here in Halifax. This is Prior House. So 4 years ago, we purchased this old house from the city. This is in Bedford, on a steep hill called School Street in Bedford, and it looks like this today. And we spent a fair amount of labor on this house, to put it mildly, to restore it. But for those of you that know anything about historical homes in this province, you can't just open them up for something like a hospice. You have very strict rules and codes, and we realized after a couple of years that this would never be the actual residential hospice. It will just be our administrative home. So we run our respite and our bereavement services out of this particular home. We have an administrative office there. This is where we hold all our meetings. It's a wonderful house. It's got a huge community room in it so we can have public events, and but essentially it will never be a residential hospice. So we're lacking that. But it was a huge catalyst for us to step forward. Something about having a house with a roof on it, we could bring people in and give them the sense of what a hospice actually would look like. The accessibility issue in this house alone was just too expensive for us to maneuver around. So, so that's where we live as of today. And I thought I'd throw in a few pictures of us. We raise money by hiking, and we have an angel tree campaign at Christmas time where people in the stores around the city put ornaments in memory of their loved ones on trees. And there's a picture of us renovating the house, one of the many pictures. And then I'm going to show you just sort of a few photos that we've collected from hospices around the country that are typical types of photos that would be on bulletin boards, out, or in people's rooms, etc. Let's go through these for you to take a look at them. Whoops, didn't want to go that quickly. They're quite lovely. I just grabbed a few before I came here tonight. Sorry to go through those so quickly. Often I have music in the background and I just didn't bring that with me tonight. So essentially, in that very brief time that I've had so far, hospice, palliative care, interchangeably used. It's not really important to us from the Hospice Society whether or not you say palliative care or hospice. It is important to us that you understand the concept of what a freestanding hospice is. And the easiest way to think about it is building a home. Building a home with 6 to 10 beds in it. That's essentially what we're looking at. And so we've had a plan, and I know this is being videoed, and there are people probably that will access this from other places in Canada who are much more familiar probably with hospice because there might be one in their community. Because there's not a hospice in Nova Scotia, it's more important for me to sort of create a picture of what it is that we're trying to create for the person. We think very strongly that the first residential hospice to be created in this province will lead to a multitude of others that will spring up, and that's certainly our plan, but we have to start somewhere. And for us, it started about 2 years ago when we finally got some traction from the community, and by that I mean the CDHA and the provincial government and community organizations. So if you went to our website, you would see, and I would urge you to do that. My last slide, I think, has the website on it. You'll see this plan. It's quite extensive, and part of my presentation tonight is how to build a hospice. It's not so much just what is a hospice. I don't think I have to convince anyone here that a hospice is a good place. It's a good thing for society. It's cost effective because there's been many, many others before us that have proven this. So where's the issue? What's the problem? Why has it been 8 years and longer for other board members? Quite frankly, this is our 12th year. To get this project moving forward. And well, essentially it's kind of like building a nursing home for starters. All the rules and regulations apply. It's not easy. It's a big capital project. It requires sustainability from the hospital system. So CDHA, our Capital Health District, has to sustain what we build. And our argument, which you'll see in a minute, is that actually is about half of what they currently pay for their own palliative care programs. So, this is kind of a summary of what I'm here to sort of talk to you a little bit more about tonight. This group of people, these large group of people who are not able to end their life at home but wish to be in that type of setting. There is no alternative in Nova Scotia at this particular time. I've already mentioned to you what residential hospices can do and what they are. The third paragraph here is rather important because now we get into our argument, which is the fiscal argument, on looking at the 20 acute care beds currently across. This is where the palliative care unit is at the VG Hospital, which, by the way, is coming down. So that's why this has started to get some legs to it. In the process of removing that unit, we spent the last year and a half working with Capital Health and a number of members of the community to try to develop a feasible plan. But essentially, the cost of delivering palliative care in residential hospice bed has been shown to be significantly less than an acute care bed. And it is. $450 a day is actually quite high, but we put that in because it's an estimate that we've gathered by going across the country and checking with all the different regions. And when you look at when you do the quick math on this, there's about a $3.3 million savings. So there's no loss here. essentially it's a shifting of services. It's taking acute care beds and using them for acute care beds and funneling that money into a hospice, and the same process, except the people go to a home instead of an acute care bed in the hospital system. And there was a time when we thought this argument alone would be enough. But it's not. For some reason, it's a very difficult process to bring about. We've gone further than that. We've actually developed relationships with a number of groups in the city, not the least of which are the Rotary Clubs. So the Rotary Clubs, there are 6 of them. I know this because I've spoken to all of them, and they've never ever come together on a project before. However, Rotary itself, and I'm not a Rotarian, but I can tell you this, my own research, they're actually quite big in the hospice movement. Certainly in Canada, they have a number of homes in Calgary and BC, that home in Vernon, for example, that I showed you. Internationally, they have this reputation. So we went to them, and we said, why don't you guys help us build a hospice? And they said, well, what's a hospice? So we gave this presentation, and they went, well, okay, we can do that. And so, but it took one club, and then the executive from the club. It's been a slow moving process, but now they're all on board, and now they want to start generating funds and making this happen. And so we go back to Capital Health, and we say, let's do this. We can build this thing. And in fact, we're not talking about building 1. We're talking about building 3, and that's based on a formula used in palliative care in Canada, where for every 100,000, you need 9 beds. And so we're in a situation here in HRM where we need 30 beds, 28 actually, but we're looking at 30. So our goal is 3 homes with 10 beds. 1 in central Halifax, 1 in Dartmouth, and 1 probably in Bedford-Sackville. So that's our long-term goal. And the Rotary are here to make the first one happen. So we went back to Capital Health, keeping in mind that we've been gleaning all the data from Capital Health, which is interesting in itself, because Capital Health couldn't answer the question, where do people die in your hospital? Because they don't all die in palliative care. Most people don't. And so it's very difficult for them. In fact, we ended up with an estimate of a question that you think they would be, and I'm not being critical here, but it stumped them. Like, we're not sure where people die, because people die all over the place in the hospital setting. And some of them leave the hospital on the day before, and they die at home. Do we count them, etc.? But essentially, most people do not die in a palliative care unit at the hospital. As I said earlier, most people die in an acute care bed somewhere in the hospital system. We've also hooked ourselves up with some local entrepreneurs who have been actually very helpful as far as pushing the business side of our plan. And this is where we're quite excited as far as a place to be. I'm just going to check to see where I am here. There's the money required for the 30 residential hospice beds across across 3 units. And we're looking for Capital Health sustainability on this. Just to give you an example, when I mentioned St. John, New Brunswick has a hospice. So they went a different route. They went totally nonprofit. They set up, and then they said, okay, it's going to cost us about $350 a day to operate this. So after being in operation for a year, they went to the provincial government, and they said, well, you guys should cost share this with us because of this very information. And it took a long time, and there's a lot of struggle back and forth. What you have in New Brunswick is you have the provincial government, Department of Health, picking up 2/3 of that cost, and the hospice generating 1/3 on a regular basis. Because once you're actually up and running as a hospice, fundraising becomes considerably much more easy than it is before you get to that place. So we have not an exact formula, but something very similar to that we've been proposing. And it's kind of stopped, which is interesting that your timing of asking me to come and speak tonight, because on Friday, this being Tuesday, we're making a presentation to a strategic initiative group that the provincial government has put in play. We have an election coming up. Again, I apologize for anyone who's not in Nova Scotia, so this is very regional what I'm talking about. But the issue of how to build one of these things is not. And so we were batted back and forth. Again, keep in mind that We have never knocked on a door where someone has closed it in our face. Everyone has, in fact, done quite the opposite. Arm around us, this is fantastic. And so we've got a host of physicians across the street who are lining up. This is what we need to be doing. We've got the Dean of the Medicine here at Dalhousie University all saying this is fantastic. So of course we got excited, thinking that maybe we'll be able to, you know, spring into action sooner than later. And we've hit this standstill because the provincial government said, well, we need to look at this before Capital Health makes any decision on it. So they did, and they held on to it for about 3 months. And then they sent it back to Capital Health and said, well, this doesn't fall under our bailiwick, it falls under yours. And so then Capital Health kept it for 3 months, and they went, I think this should go to this new strategic initiative that the provincial government has put forward on palliative care. And that's where we're going on Friday. And you know what? It's not a really good place to go, because that specific committee, after 8 years of doing this, they don't have any power or any authority. And so I know I sound a little frustrated, but it's difficult because there's nothing wrong with the formula. There's nothing wrong with what we're trying to put together. It makes sense in all aspects. We've got a community group that wants to build it. We've got a model that says it's actually much more economic to sustain hospice beds than acute care beds, and yet we seem to be stuck. And so I'm well past the presentations on what a hospice is. I take every advantage of every situation I'm in these days to say, we need your support. We need people to step forward and say, yeah, the person that knocks on my door for this election, I'm going to talk about this because it's important and it touches all of us. And this province should have at least 5 hospices, and there are small groups like ours around the province, and for whatever reason it just hasn't taken grip. If you ever talk to someone who grew up in England, you'll get a very different take on hospice. You'll get something to the effect, I know because we have several board members from England, and they'll say things like, yeah, the hospice was at the bottom of my street. I used to kick a ball around in the backyard of the hospice. It's part of their lingo. It's just very common, and there's no stigma attached to it. It's just, and then they're always old homes. And there are places in Canada you can go to find very similar hospices like that. For example, if you went to Vancouver, they have the only children's hospital, hospice rather, in Canada. Beautiful old home in sort of the northeastern part of the city, but they're rare, and that's a problem for us. And as I keep on saying, they're even rarer in this particular part of the world. And for the life of me, I don't know why. And so I'm not sure where my slide goes here, but that is the hospice website. Everything that I had tonight and more is on. We have a newsletter, we have an education program, and obviously we have fundraising and networking and everything else that all nonprofits do. But maybe I'll stop there and just open it up if you have any questions. I do appreciate your lending your ears to my grieving tonight, or complaining, or whatever it is you call. But we're really close, and I'm still optimistic enough that this time next year we'll have shovel in ground and we'll have some kind of announcement. But the initiative is not there, and I think we're at a point, we're actually meeting this Thursday for a few hours as a group trying to brainstorm what to do next, who to call, what cards to play, etc., to make this happen. We even have sites, like the site we've been looking at recently is the Bloomfield Center site, again, because that's being redeveloped, and we've talked to that particular group, and they're quite interested in putting a hospice within that structure. So there's not a lot of questions we can't answer when it comes to this particular project. So the question is there sort of alumni from a university type setting that might want to contribute to such a project?
Something like that. I don't know if that exists or if that's available.
Well, no, I can answer that. I mean, I work for a university, and I can tell you that the external side of money at university is directed at universities. And while I mentioned that Dalhousie would be interested in being, we're actually looking at a center of excellence as a teaching place as well. So that's essentially the tie-in we have with the med school, is that that we want to, they have a palliative care training program, and we want to incorporate this place as part of that program.
You funnel through the university into the hospice.
Yeah, well, it'd be more the other way around. The hospice would exist without the university, but since it's going to exist close to the university, then we would open up the opportunity for physicians to come in. And that's mainly because the physicians on our board are very open to that and really want to make this sort of so-called center of excellence. But in answer to your question, it's not an avenue we've gone down. I think if I knocked on the president's door at Dalhousie University, I don't think he'd know, in no disrespect to Dr. Travis, what this is all about. I mean, it's one of many local community projects that we find ourselves up against a lot when we're looking for funding. But the idea of championing or having someone champion this is certainly not lost on us. And we've tried and, you know, connected various people. I mean, essentially, it touches all of us at certain times in your life. So when I for example, today I was teaching an introductory class in kinesiology. So they're all 18 19 years old. And somehow this came up. I think I mentioned that I was going to be speaking to you tonight. Well, it's a very different audience. So when I speak to an audience that young, it's not the same as speaking with you or anyone else who's been connected or with death and dying. But eventually, through our own experiences, it happens. And when you find someone who's had that experience, what we hear is that it sounds a whole lot like me and my dad. That's what people say, you know, and those are the people that are easy to get on board. And so eventually, someone with deeper pockets will also get on board who's had that kind of experience, but we're not there yet, although we definitely have not given up hope in trying. If you look across Canada, you'll find that many of the smaller hospices are sponsored by one or two individuals. You know, Don Cherry, if you hate him or love him,
Really?
yeah. When his wife,
surprising.
I know, yeah. When his wife died, he created a hospice in her name. So there are examples of people that have done that, and certainly we would take that. We thought we actually had that, and we do to a certain extent with the Rotary Group. I mean, they're willing to build it, and that's no small thing.
Bill Gates is the Warren Buffett of the world, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Like, where are they? And yeah.
There's a lot of them around. Yeah, that's the other thing.
Well, again, these are good ideas, and they're not some corporate sponsorship is not something that we haven't considered. I don't know if you've been involved in any type of projects like these, but they're big, and there's a process you need to go through. You don't just sort of say, "Who's the president of the company? Can I send this person a letter?" And I'm not being sarcastic. It's very difficult because it's a very challenging time to access this kind of money. And so the money we want, we already have. The money that we need is actually not coming from the Bill Gates of the world, it's coming from Capital Health. We want sustainability money. Yeah, we feel very confident we can build these things. Very, very confident, in fact. But when you build them, our Rotarian friends are going to step back and say, well, now you have to sustain it. And the sustainability model, clearly, and I would urge you to take a look at the plan on our site, makes perfect sense. We're not making this up. We're using data from Capital Health themselves. Plus, we're using data from 3 other health districts across the country to indicate and to show how economical hospice is, how accepted it is, how good it is, how important it is. So we feel that there's nothing more to add than what we've already said. So we've come to this stone wall where the health district has said, well, no, we're going to, and again, there's politics involved. I mean, it's a very difficult time to make these things happen. And we're talking about hospital beds, which are golden. And when you talk about hospital beds, because ironically, you won't actually see a change in the number of hospital beds the way this will work. It's a shifting. There's no additional costs. There's money saved, but greater number of beds appearing? No, that's not what this is meant. So if you're a politician, you want to be able to say, I'm going to increase number of beds, but you're not going to be able to say that with this. So that makes it more difficult. It really does, and we recognize that. So we're constantly trying to get at the table. We've been at the table with the provincial government and Capital Health. As I mentioned, we're back on Friday to try to make our case. But now we're at a different table, and well, because yeah, it's a little more complicated than that, but it's not an argument that that someone can run with. I think the better argument is there is a money saved argument. It depends on what the organization wishes to do with that money that's saved, and that's not for us to say, except to show that it is. And again, I have to emphasize the figures I'm using here are actually exaggerated. Typically, it's closer to $1,200 a day for an acute care bed, and it's closer to $300 a day for a hospice. But we're using $1,000 and $450 to make it a little more realistic and
What about all the money and initiatives for improving mental health?
not sure what the question is. The money for mental health.
Frame it as a mental health service. Because in a sense it is.
Well, I guess I would answer that we don't feel the need to do that, because I think the service itself sort of stands alone. It's palliative care, and it doesn't. I mean, while I agree it has a mental health component to it, it doesn't, I think, in our view, need to be that, because it's a standalone need. We don't do a very good job in death and dying in this country.
We justify the money, because mental health is improving everybody's mental health. The government, they're strategizing and initiating.
Yeah, we don't have a mental health theme in our business plan. While I certainly agree there are psychosocial benefits to having hospice care, and if there are pockets of money there, again, part of us, I think, would not want to take mental health funding, because mental health is also an area that's very and it's underserved in itself. And we might get to that point one day, and I hope we don't. Yeah, I mean, what we're saying is the money's there. We can build these things. I mean, Capital Health, the provincial government, if you look at their where they stand these days, it's all about community partnerships. And quite frankly, there's probably not a stronger community partnership than what we've put together here. The Hospice Society itself has been around for 12 years. We're taking 6 Rotary clubs who've never worked together, for the first time ever, are coming together from all the regions of the city. We've got an entrepreneur group, and we've got a host of persons from medical professions who are on board on this. I didn't even throw in the university side of things. So we have that community partnership, and I mean,
Yeah,
no, it really is. It's like,
yeah.
It's like somebody's deaf, or they don't see down the road.
Yeah, and I mean, I had hoped to be able to come here tonight, if in January, I think, when this date was finalized, and be able to make this into a much happier night and talk about where we're going to be digging the hole for the first hospice in Nova Scotia. We're not there yet. In fact, we kind of got kicked in the shins about 2 weeks ago, and now we're kind of hurting a little bit on what to do next. But we're not giving up. We're just going at it again from a different angle and trying to figure out how to maintain this. I should say that we continue to offer all our services, our respite and our bereavement in particular, and our education programs. So it's not like we're standing still. But the actual beds, well, that's a whole other matter. And the beds is really the crunch. It's the piece that we need to deliver on. And it becomes very difficult as an organization after 12 years and not producing. It's difficult. It's harder to get fundraising going. It really is. People want to see that. People come knocking on our door, that Bedford home, and they say, well, where are the beds? How come there aren't people here? I want to see them, because that's what I had hoped would happen. So we feel a lot of pressure and in this sense as well. It's been a real experience for me, and I think for all of us, in many good ways, mostly good, in the sense that, the recognition that this is really missing. It's a really missing link that we all will feel. We really will, and no one should have to live behind a curtain in an acute care bed. It's just the wrong place to be. Yeah, it's just it honestly is, and it's not where you want to be, and it's not conducive to family. It's not conducive to anything really. But that's the framework that we currently live in, and the question is, what would a home actually look like? We used to meet at a place in Waverley. It was a bed and breakfast. This couple had built a bed and breakfast that looked to us like a hospice. It was accessible. It had a central kitchen and living room and 6 bedrooms in a circle, each bedroom with its own bathroom. It had a beautiful landscape yard, and it had parking. And we started meeting there because it was for sale. And the woman who owned it, I think, thought eventually she'd sell it to us. course, we knew we couldn't buy it, but we would meet there on a monthly basis for about a year, so that we could all sort of take in what, and feel what a hospice might look like. It would probably look something like that. It would be a home. It would be surrounded by, a garden. It would probably have a little playground area. It would have 10 accessible bedrooms. It would have no more than 10. And we actually started out thinking smaller, because there comes a point in time when that becomes more of an institution, and that's not the intent. But that's where we're heading down in the current plan anyways. It would have, kitchen. It would look like the home that I live in right now. Really, in the sense that I don't have 10 bedrooms, but it would look a lot like that. There'd be, there wouldn't be duplicate kitchens or anything of that nature, but people would have the freedom to come and use the house any way they chose. There'd be a library. There'd be a place where people could come in and have privacy. There'd be a place where, we could offer things like yoga for respite, massage therapy. Reiki. I mean, there would be a quiet place for that. This would be ideal. Now, our colleagues in New Brunswick don't have all of that, because they purchased an old convent, so they had to build around what they actually had, and they spent a lot of money, and it's a fantastic facility. Now, if you ask them, is it perfect? No, they would like to have different space, knock down some of the walls, because they had a lot of small rooms in the convent. Yeah, we've looked at, over the years, a number of facilities in Halifax. Came to the conclusion that the simplest process is actually to build from the ground up. For various reasons, but mostly for planning reasons. We've been in conversation with, for example, the fire marshal and the regulations. I mean, it's not a simple project, so I mentioned the bed and breakfast, but that wouldn't have actually worked. There are more regulations than that, but it gave us a sense of what we were looking at. Probably the best thing, if I was to describe this, is a wide open kitchen area where people come and go and meet, and comfort rooms around, because there's a lot of movement in hospices. People come and go, people stay over.
Family members?
Absolutely, yeah. Family members. There are no rules and regulations. It's a home. It's just like bringing guests into your home. And it's from a sustainability issue, I think it's important. I didn't go into this, but if you were to read the business plan, you would get all the details. Essentially, sustainability is quite inexpensive. You're dealing with nursing care, because again, it's a stage of life. It's terminal illness, and it's comfort, and it's symptoms. You're visited by the same physicians that are already in the system, and I know because one of them's on our board, a guy named Dr. Rob Horton, and he would be one of the physicians that would come to the hospice. We wouldn't come every day. He'd probably come every other day, and we'd have someone on call. You'd have a couple nurses around the clock, and you'd have then you tie into your volunteer network for things like food services and cleaning, etc. And you'd have the respite program and bereavement program, and you'd have the education program, and it all happened around this one building. And
every age span, I would imagine.
Well, we're not. We won't be a children's hospice. But certainly, yeah, absolutely, because we would deal with our intakes would come from the palliative care unit here across the street. So that's essentially what the process would be, and. Yeah, it's a plan that I think would actually work quite well. That's where we have a lot of expertise, is if we actually get going, because we have a lot of medical professionals who are involved in this project, who are ready to take it to the next level, so to speak. But again, that we're kind of treading water a little bit today, and this is not to sound too sour on this, but the provincial government, any provincial government, looks at a very different picture. And so, because we were actually the first, and we've been working the longest here in Halifax, and obviously we now have colleagues across the province who are also picking this up, just like in New Brunswick. St. John was the first, but because they're government funded now, well, there's a model in place, and so there's several. And if you go to Moncton, if you go to Fredericton, if you go to Bathurst, they also have hospice groups, and so this is what occurs. With us, it's actually happened a little backwards. So we were ready to strike, and now the government says, well, this isn't fair. We should sort of spread this out, and let's have a plan. Let's think about this from a provincial perspective. And you know, we'd like to say, well, you can do that, but you can also do that at the same time. Start somewhere, and you should start where it's most likely to occur, and we think that's right here, right now, and because of the funding mechanism that we have in place, and I think it will happen. I really do. There seems to be goodwill on the part of the CEO of Capital Health, for example. It's just. You know, we're in foreign territory here. It's not our forte to navigate through provincial channels. And Capital Health and the Department of Health and Wellness kind of work together and kind of don't work together, and that's what we're finding. And so we've presented to this group twice, we've presented to this group 3 times, and now we're asked to present to a group that sort of sits in the middle. And we'll just keep on presenting, and eventually it will happen. Probably the biggest takeaway is if I would ask is to indicate to people that this is a project that's ready for the taking, and we need some leadership on this. And certainly, you know, 8 years ago when I first joined, you know, most of this evening would have been spent just talking about a hospice. Well, what is it? You know, and we're well past that. Now it's kind of like, why don't we have one? And why are we? Capital Health is the largest district in Canada without a hospice. I mean, it's as simple as that. And so that alone, I think, is a little shameful, and something that we're trying to obviously encourage them to change. And it will change. I mean, on a different night, I'm probably smiling more, a little more optimistic, because this is how it happens. In any kind of organization like this, you have your ups and downs, and right now you kind of got me in the valley. And you know, soon someone will come along and knock on our door. Probably won't be Bill Gates, but someone who who wants to lend a hand. That's what happens. It's
Like
just
Jimmy Spats or something.
yeah. Anyone of that nature. And so anyways, I do thank you for your time, and I know that there are a lot of issues in the world, and this is just one of them. However, this one touches all of us, and you know, it's about being comfortable. It's about being, you know, feel like you are in a warm setting with your loved ones around. It's about my mother's experience is what it's about, and that experience should be available to all of us. And quite frankly, it's not, and it's just a matter of changing that.
I think when it comes to a topic as important as this one, Fred, that for all of us, it's, you know, I know that my level of awareness has been heightened this evening, and I'm sure that you've created that on some level for everyone here. And because we've all been touched by pancreatic cancer in some way, we certainly recognize how important reaching out to people who have been affected by one of the many cancers, how this kind of resource can totally make a difference in the quality of their life, as well as the quality of the families' lives, as they're helping their loved one reach the end of the road. So thanks so much, and thanks for your passion and your dedication to such an important cause.
Well, thank you for having me, and hope I come back, and next time I'll have a different story to tell. Yeah,
And
3
have
buildings.
a picture of the house.
I will
Real house.
invite you all here. So. Thank you very much.
I had no idea there was not a home. I'm really shocked. What is this? Don't have